In the previous part, Martin has gone through creating the main simple block out of the machine, and in this part we'll be completing the block out. Like last time, I'll start with a breakdown of what to expect in this section and some of the key tools and ideas used. We'll start off by breaking down the concept further to keep our scale consistent. We'll be using Alt-P to clear parents, Shift-S for the snapping menu and in particular snapping objects to a location whilst keeping their relative positions intact. We'll look at the conveyor belt, starting with the straight section, then the curved section where we'll bring in the spin tool. We'll use the shrink fatten tool for the conveyor belt support bracket, the Control-B shortcut to bevel, and as in the last chapter, Alt-E for the more complete extrude menu to get our extruding happening along the face normals. Then we'll move on to the large and small pipes, getting the little modular kit together basically. Then we can start laying out those pipes and see the use of applying rotation. We'll then move on to blocking out the cavern itself, starting with a trusty cube and using cubes to start placing out the main cave vertical pillars. For the cavern floor, we'll add a plane and extend it for the tunnels. For the cavern walls, we'll extrude and flip the normals. We'll then join all the cavern parts together with Ctrl-J and take advantage of our remesh modifier to give us a nice clean start for when we start sculpting in the next chapter. So let's get right into it and pass it over to Martin.
Okay, so the next thing I'm going to work on is the conveyor belt, and that's made up of three main sections. There's a repeating piece of straight track here, and then there is this curve, and then we have this bracket object which is placed at intervals along the length of the whole thing. So in comparison to the machine, I think it's going to be quite quick to make, and again as before I'm going to bring up some characters to help me measure it. And because of the perspective, it's going to be difficult to get exact measurements again, but this will give me a good starting point. So I'm just going to hide this character here for now, and I'm going to say that this flat area at the top of the track is about as wide as the feet of these two characters standing side by side. And then this sloping section, which appears on the left and the right, I'm going to bring this character back, and I'm going to say that that's about as wide as this character on the left from wrist to wrist. Okay, so over in Blender, I first want to get a couple of characters to help me measure my track. So I'm going to go to my layer with the characters in, and I'm going to select two of them from the group. And if I go into my front view with one on my keypad, if I just duplicate these now with Shift-D, as I move them around, you can see that there are dashed lines showing that they are still children of the central character. So I don't want them to be part of this group anymore, so I'm going to right click to leave them in place. And then I'm going to press Alt-P, which will bring up the Clear Parent menu. And I'm going to choose Clear and Keep Transformation. And that will leave them in place, but remove them from the parenting group. Next, I'm going to move these characters to layer 1. So I'm going to press M and click the first layer swatch, and then switch to layer 1. And now I want these characters to be placed at the origin. But if I just press Shift-S and then choose Selection to Cursor, it will move each of them individually, and I don't want that. So I can undo that and then press Shift-S again and instead choose Selection to Cursor with Offset, and that will maintain the spacing between the objects. Next, I want to duplicate one of these characters and place it on the left here. So I'm going to select that one and then press Shift-D and then X and then just place it end to end. Next, I'm going to create a cube, and instead of doing it from the Create tab this time, I'm going to press Shift-A, which will give me a pop-up version of the Create tab, and I can go to Mesh and then choose Cube. So I'm going to go into wireframe mode, and I want the vertices at the bottom to be sitting on the ground, so I'm going to tab into edit mode, drop my selection, and then box select the verts at the bottom, and then I can press G, Z, 1, and then press return. And to select the ones at the top now, so I can lower them, I can drop my selection and create a new box selection, or I can press Ctrl-I, which will invert the current selection. So now I can just move those vertices down. And I'm just going to eyeball this. I'm going to place them at roughly knee height. And I've just noticed that the pivot point is still set to 3D cursor, so for now I'm going to change that back to median point to bring the gizmo to the center of what I've got selected. Now I'm going to press A twice to select everything, and I want to scale these vertices out so that it meets up with the side of this character's wrist. So I'm going to press S and then just scale it on the X-axis by pressing X, and then using Shift if I need to just to slow it down. I'm going to place it around there. Next, I'm going to cut some edges into this cube so I can begin to shape it. So I'm going to drop my selection and then press Ctrl-R for the loop cut and slide tool. and as before it's made this pink line to show where the edges are going to be cut. But I want 2 sets of edges, so I'm going to press page up, and then I can click to place it, and as before it will let me slide it around, but I don't want it to slide, so I can just right click and leave them in place. So next I want to scale these edges out on the x-axis so that they rest on the sides of these characters' feet here. So I'm going to press S and then X again, and then just bring those out to about there. Okay, the next thing I want to do is lower these corners. So I'm going to drop my selection and then do 2 box selections around these vertices, and then just lower them down to, let's say, about there. Okay, so now I've got my basic profile shape for the track, and so I don't really need these characters anymore. So I'm going to go into object mode and then drop my selection and then box select those and just delete them. So with that object made, I'm now going to position it better in the world so that it works better with the concept. And going back to the concept, I'm just going to turn my characters off. The conveyor belt is pretty much at a right angle going through the scene, but obviously this corner has been kind of knocked off into a curve shape. So when it comes to where it is in relation to the machine, it's actually quite close. So I'm going to bring my object over to the left hand side and start placing it and then working on the different sections. So first of all, I'm going to bring back my grid floor. I'm going to go over to my property shelf and click on grid floor, and then I'm going to hold shift and click on my second layer to bring my machine back. And I want to bring this object over to the left hand side here, and I'm going to do that and snap it nicely to the grid. I'm going to do that by using the snap tools down here. I'm going to change the snap element to increment, and so when I hold control and then click on the red x-axis on the gizmo, it allows me to snap the object properly to the grid spacing. And I'm going to leave it, well, it's roughly 1 grid space away from the edge of the podium that the machine sits on. So right now this object is sitting on the x-axis and I want it to be pulled further this way along the y, so I'm going to hold control and then click on the y arrow on the gizmo. I'm going to move it 2 spaces up, and next I'm going to go into edit mode and then do a box selection around these vertices and then snap them using control again back to the x axis line. Then I'm going to press Ctrl I to select the opposite vertices and then move them 1 space further back in the y. And this will be the repeating section of track that I use to create most of the conveyor belt. And the reason I move the vertices like that is because it leaves the origin nicely in the center and snap to the grid. Next, I want to create some copies of this to start filling in the conveyor belt track. So I'm going to go into solid view and object mode, and then I'm going to duplicate this with Shift D and then press Y to move it on the Y axis and hold Control to make it snap to the increments. And I'm just going to press Shift R to create another copy there. And going back to my first one, I want to create another copy, but I want to create it so that it's on this side of the grid. So I'm going to do Shift D again and then press Y and then hold Control and snap it down here. Then I'm going to rotate it in the Z, so R, Z, 90, and then press return. And then I'm going to move it along the x-axis, so G, X, and then hold Control and then have it so that it snaps to the y-axis line. And I just need to move it down a further grid space in the y-axis, so I'm going to hold Control and just click and drag that over there. So next I want to create this curved section which will join these 2 sections together, and I'm going to do that beginning with my original object again, and I'm going to duplicate it and then right click to leave it in place, and then I'm going to press Shift H to hide everything else. So for this next part I don't actually need the entire object, I just need the faces that make up the end of this object and make the profile shape for the track. So I can press Tab for edit mode, and I've still got these verts selected from before, so I can just press X and delete them. So now I'm left with just these faces. And the next part I'm going to use a tool in the tool tab called Spin, and that will extrude these faces and rotate that extrusion around the 3D cursor, and that will help me make this curve shape that I need for my track. So I'm going to press A to select everything, but when I click Spin I get this result, which is kind of strange. It's all sticking up in the air and the normals are flipped, and that's because Spin relies on the angle of view. So I'm going to undo that and then press 7 on my keypad to go into top view and then press Spin again. And now it's more like what I want to see, but it's still inside out and it's going the wrong way. And that's because in the options here, it's using the angle of 90 degrees. So it's going 90 degrees clockwise. So if I change that to negative 90, that's now creating the object that I want. But in this case, I actually want the object to be about halfway around the curve and not be the entire curve all in one object. So I'm going to change the angle to negative 45. And then looking at this stepped value, 9 is too many. I think I can get away with 4. The next thing I want to do is change the origin of this object. Because the faces were derived from a copy of the track, the origin's here and it's not really much use to me there. So I want to put it to where the 3D cursor is, the origin for the scene. So I'm going to tab into object mode and then press Shift, Control, Alt and C and then choose origin to 3D cursor. So now when I press Shift D to duplicate and then R for rotate and then Z and then 45, it makes a copy that snaps nicely to the original one. And if I press Alt H to bring everything back, that also snaps quite well to the track object down here. Finally, for the track, I'm going to duplicate another couple of copies of this track piece here to even up the sides. So as before, I'm going to duplicate and then press X, and then holding Control, I'm just going to snap that further up the grid, and then I'm going to press Shift R to create the final copy. Alright, so the next thing I'm going to make is this bracket object which supports the conveyor belt. And as before, I'm going to use one of my track pieces as a basis for this object. I'm going to select this one and then hide everything else with Shift H. And then I'm going to duplicate it with Shift D and right click to leave it in place. And the first thing I want to do is make it much more narrow than it currently is. So I'm going to tab into edit mode and then press A twice. And I want to scale it on the Y axis, so I'm going to press S and then Y. And I'm just going to eyeball this. I'm just going to bring this into around there. So next I want to remove some of these faces. If I go into solid mode, I only really need the faces at the sides and the top of this object. So I'm going to Control Tab into face mode and then just select these faces. And then I can press Control I to invert my selection. And then I can press X and then delete those faces. So now I've just got this band of polygons. Looking back at the concept, you can see that this bracket is it's raised above and is scaled outwards from the track object. So I want to represent that. I'm going to do that in the front view. So I'm going to press 1 on my keypad and I'm going to go back into wireframe mode. And over here in the Tools tab, there's a tool called Shrink Flatten, which you can get to by pressing Alt S. And if I press Alt S, you can see that it moves those faces away along their normals. So I'm going to move that up to about here. And one of the things that it does with the default settings is it brings in angles which you don't necessarily want. I want this face here to be as straight as this one. And over here in the options there's a tick box called Offset Even. So if I tick that on, all of those angles are now removed and it's got a uniform distance away from the track object. So the next thing I want to do, looking back at the concept, at the top of this bracket there's a kind of a raised notch type area. So I'm going to represent that by selecting this top face and then extruding it up with E, and I'm just going to raise it up a little bit. And when I go into solid mode, you can see now that that's created faces at the front and the back. So I want to select those and then delete them. So selecting this top face again, I want to scale it in a small amount just on the X axis. So I'm going to press S and then X and then just bring that into somewhere like there. Okay, the next thing I want to do is to bevel these corners. Looking back at the concept again, you can see this light fixture is sitting on this kind of square notched corner here. So I'm going to begin that by going into edge mode with Control Tab and then selecting these edges here. And then I can press Control B for bevel. And as I move my mouse, it will bevel those edges. And I just want to bevel it a little bit. Okay, so now I've got the basic shape and now I want to give the object some thickness. So I want to press A twice to select everything. I'm going to do this in the front view again. And I want to now extrude these faces. So I'm going to press Alt E and then choose Region Vertex Normals. So as I move the mouse, I'm just going to eyeball it. You can see that the same with the Shrink Flatten tool, it's brought in angles that I don't want. I want everything to be nice and uniform and straight. So as before, I can press the Offset Even option and that will make all of those angles uniform again. So for the object then, that's pretty much it. One thing actually, I just want to scale this in a little bit more. So I'm going to press A twice and then press S and Y. I'm just going to bring that in. so that this face on the corner is a bit more square. Next I'm going to tab back into object mode and then press Alt H to bring everything back, and then reselect my bracket. And now I need to place these along the track, and I'm going to place them at the intersection of each track piece. So to begin with, I need to get this one away from the center of this track piece, and I'm going to do that with holding Control and then clicking and dragging on the Y axis on the gizmo. And then I'm going to press Shift D and then press Y and then hold Control to snap the next one to the next intersection. Then I can press Shift R a couple of times to create my other copies at the other intersections. Looking back at the concept, you can see that there's a bracket right in the center of the curve. So to make that one, I'm going to select the one at the beginning of the curve and duplicate it, but I want to rotate it around the 3D cursor. So I'm going to change the pivot point to 3D cursor and then press Shift D, R for rotate, Z for the Z axis, and then 45. And now that's placed it nicely in the middle there. I can just press Shift R again to get this bracket on the end of the curve. And to make these ones, it's the same process, but it's along the X axis. So I can press Shift D, X, and then hold Control, and then snap that in place. And as before, I can press Shift R a couple of times to make the final copies. So looking at the scene in solid mode, the conveyor belt is basically in place, and just for neatness I'm going to place the conveyor belt on its own layer. So I'm going to click on my first layer and then press A twice to select all the objects, and then I'm going to press M and move those to layer 3. Okay, so the next thing I want to make is this series of pipes, and right now I'm not too worried about their position in the scene because I haven't made the Cavem yet. So when I've made the Cavem, I can position these more accurately, but for now I want to make a basic set of objects like a straight and a bend and a T-junction, and then I can block out this arrangement of pipes and then place them more properly later on. Taking a closer look at these pipe sections then, I'm first going to look at this straight section here, and as before I've got some guides lined up for it, and the diameter of this pipe seems to be about as long as the character's legs. And looking at this next guide, I've made some characters roughly match the angle of this pipe section, and going from the bottom of the feet of this character, it seems to reach about the waist height of a second character stacked end to end. Next I'm going to look at the bend in this pipe, and I've got a guide for that as well. And before I turn the guides on, you can see that this bend is pretty much a quarter of a torus. And so if I bring the guides in, the dimensions of this, it's about 3 characters wide. And if you imagine this as a torus, this would be the center at say 6 o'clock. And this line here would be at 3 o'clock, so that bottom right hand corner of a torus. So bringing the guides back, it's about 3 characters wide from the center line of the torus to the edge. And from the bottom to the middle line here, it's just over a character tall. It's about a character and a head. So to make these objects, what I'm actually going to do is start with this bend and create a torus for it. I'm then going to use that to create the straight section, and then I'm also going to create a T section which will help me create this piece down here. And looking at the pipes at the bottom, you can see that they're actually a bit smaller than this larger pipe at the top, and I've got a guide lined up to measure this bottom pipe, and looking at it you can see that the diameter of the pipe is about equal to the middle of the character's thigh. So what I'm going to do is create my large pipes and then duplicate them as a set, and then use those to create the lower pipes. So back in Blender, I'm going to go back to my character layer, and I want to duplicate 3 of my characters for measuring purposes. So I'm going to select the ones in the center and then duplicate them and right click to leave them in place. And then I'm going to press M and move them to my first layer and then switch to it. And going in my front view, I actually want to line my characters up so that the side of this character here is lined up with the blue Z axis line. So I'm going to click and drag them along the X a little bit. And next I want to look back at the concept, because these characters here show that the quarter of this torus is actually a bit taller than a character. It's about an extra head's height. So I'm going to duplicate this character at the end and move it in the Z axis, and just move it up so that the head is sticking out above the top of the lower character. Next I want to measure the single straight section of pipe. So I want to select the character in the center and then press Shift D, and I want this one to be laying down on its side on the X axis, so I'm going to press R and then -90. and the pipe is about 1.5 characters long, so I want to create another copy with Shift D and then move it in the x-axis, and I'm just going to place that end to end. So this may look a bit strange for now, but hopefully it will start making sense when I create the torus. So I'm going to press Shift A and bring up my add menu and then choose torus, and as before I want my object to be facing the front view, and this time I'm going to click this checkbox saying align to view, and you can see that it changes the rotation value in the x-axis for me. And now I can go into wireframe mode, and before I begin sizing this torus I want to decide on the segments and divisions in the object. So I'm going to go over to major segments and I'm going to change that to 32, and then I'm going to change the minor segments to 8. Okay, now I want this to be resting on the ground, and the way I'm going to do that is by adding the major radius value and the minor radius value together and then putting that into the Z field for the location of the object. So I'm going to change that to 1.25, and now that's resting nicely on the ground. The next thing I want to do is work out the diameter for the pipe, and it needs to be roughly in line with the crotch of the character. So let's change this minor radius to 0.35. And then because that's pushed it below the origin, I want to change my Z value to 1.35. And I think that's about right. Okay, so now I need to work out the overall diameter of the whole object. And if I zoom out so you can just see the major grid divisions, the top of this second character's head, this extra head's height here, is just above the second blend unit up on the Z axis. So that means that the radius of the torus, if the halfway point was to rest on that grid line, would be 2. So I want to make it slightly less than 2 because I need to take into account the minor radius value and how that will change the overall size of the object. So I'm going to change the major radius to something like 1.75. And now I've pushed the torus well below the origin point, so I'm going to change my Z value again. So that's now 2.1, and I think that's not too bad. The halfway point of the torus is just above the head of the character there, and the overall radius is pushing it out so that it's a little bit wider than the third character. And because we were eyeballing these measurements and it's a perspective drawing, I don't think that's too bad. I think that will do. So the next thing I want to do is take my torus and get rid of the geometry I don't need. So I'm going to tab into edit mode and then drop my selection, and then control tab into face mode, and I just want to select the faces that make up the bottom quarter of this torus. So I'm going to do a box selection and then just select all of those, and then I can press Ctrl I to invert my selection, and then X, and then delete those faces. So now in solid view you can see I have the bend for the pipes. Okay, the next thing I want to do is change my object's origin. Right now it's in the center of what was the torus, but that's not much use to me there. I want it to be in the center of this cross section of the pipe. So I'm going to Control Tab into edge mode, and I want to select all of the edges that go around this section. So I'm going to hold down Alt and then right click on one of the edges, and that will select the entire edge loop. Next I'm going to move my 3D cursor to the center with Shift S and choose Cursor to Selected. Then in object mode I can press Shift, Control, Alt and C and then choose Origin to 3D Cursor. Okay, next I want to create the single length of pipe, and if I go back into edit mode I've still got those edges selected. So now I can go into front view, and I need to extrude these out so that they match up roughly with the waist of this second character on the left. So I'm going to press E and then X and then just drag that out to about there. So now I want to separate these into two different objects. So I'm going to go back into wireframe and I'm going to Control Tab into face mode and then just box select the faces that make up this pipe here, and then press P for the separate menu and then choose selection. So that's all fine. They're my two sections now, and I'm going to press Shift H to hide the characters, make it a bit easier to read the scene. And the next thing I want to make is a T section. So what I'm going to do is press Shift D to duplicate this this straight pipe, and then just move that over on the X axis. And then I want to take this one and put a loop cut in the center of the object to find the center point. So I'm going to go into edit mode and then press Ctrl R, and then I can just press enter twice, and that will place that new loop of edges in the center of the object. Next I'm going to go back to object mode and then duplicate this pipe, and I want to snap it to the center. So I'm going to go in my front view again, and I want to change my snapping elements over to vertex. So now when I press Shift D and duplicate, I can leave it in place and then just click on the red X axis and then hold Control and then move it and snap it to one of the vertices that I've just created in the center. So at the moment my pivot point is set to 3D cursor, so I'm going to change that back to median point, and now I can rotate this pipe so it's vertical. So I'm going to press R 90, and now if I go into solid view, I've got these two pipes and they're lined up the way I want, but they're still separate objects, and I'm going to combine these by using a Boolean modifier. So going over to the modifiers section of the properties panel, I can click into the list and then choose Boolean, and over here in the settings for that it gives me a blank field here where I can choose my object that I want to Boolean with. So I'm just going to right click on the object here, this vertical section, and see what it's called. It's called Torus 005. So when I click back onto this horizontal piece, I can just start typing Torus and then choose 005 from the list. And by default it's set to intersect, so it's just removed a whole chunk of geometry. Instead I want to change this to be union so that it joins them together. And then when that's done, I can just click the apply button and that will remove the modifier and finalize the operation. So when I move this around, I've now got this single bit of geometry that represents my T section, but I've still got this extra vertical section that I don't really need. So I can right click on that and then press X and delete it. Okay, so I now have my three sections of pipe, and they've all got origins where they're useful at the ends of the pipes here at the cross section. And the last thing I want to do is to make this vertical part of the T section about half of what it is now. So I'm going to go into my front view and then go into edit mode, and I've still got my division here where I cut an extra edge in. So I can press A to deselect, and then I'm going to go into wireframe mode and then Control Tab into vertex mode. And then I can just select these verts at the top and then press X and then delete those vertices. Okay, so now I've got my three pipe sections, and next I want to duplicate them to make the smaller pipes at the bottom. So I'm going to tab into object mode and then press Alt H to unhide my characters. And I'm going to select my pipes, and I want to duplicate and scale them down so that the diameter of the pipe is roughly in line with the middle of this character's thigh. So I'm going to use the 3D cursor in this case. I'm going to press Shift and C to bring the 3D cursor back to the origin, and then I'm going to press Shift D and duplicate those pipes and just leave them in place. And I'm going to change my pivot point to 3D cursor. So when I press S, I can scale them down, and I'm just going to eyeball it so that the diameter of this pipe here reaches about the middle of the thigh. Okay, so I've got my smaller pipes now, and so I'm going to move those up so that they're out of the way, and then I'm going to select my larger pipes and just move those down. And now I don't really need these characters anymore, so I'm going to drop my current selection and then box select these characters and then just delete them. Next I want to snap copies of these pipe sections together to represent what's going on in the concept, and I'm going to start with this large pipe at the top. So I've got the bend, and then I have a vertical straight section and a horizontal straight section, and then another bend, and then another straight. So before I begin snapping copies of these pipes together, I want to apply the transforms, and that's because I'll just select this one here, and then if you go up here on the properties shelf to the rotations, because these were derived from the torus and that had an X rotation of 90, all of these objects have an X rotation of 90. So I want to apply these transforms and get those values back to 0. So I'm going to box select all the objects and then do Control A, and then I'm going to apply rotation. So now all of those values for X are set to 0. Next I'm going to hide the smaller sections of pipe and come back to them later. So I'm going to drop my selection and then box select them and hide them with H. And for now I don't need this T section, so I'm going to select that, just move it over to the left for now. And next I'm going to change my pivot point back to median, and then select the straight section of pipe. And I just want to snap it to the end of the pipe bend. So I've still got my snap set to vertex, so when I hold Control and then click on the X arrow, it will snap it to the end of the bend there. So I want to duplicate this now and snap it to the opposite end of the pipe bend. So I'm going to press Shift D and then X, and then holding Control, I'm just going to snap it to the central vertex at the end of the pipe there. And similarly with the Z axis, I can hold Control and click with the blue arrow and then snap it to the top. And now I can press R90 to rotate it 90 degrees. Okay, so next I want to duplicate the pipe bend itself, and I'm going to press Shift D, X, and then holding Control, I can just snap it to the end of the pipe like that. Next I'm going to rotate it, so R180. And if you look at it in an ortho view, I actually want the pipe to be bending around this way so that it ends up heading off and being embedded in the wall of the cavern. So I'm going to do this in my top view. I'm going to press R, X, 90, and now I can duplicate this straight and attach it to the end of this pipe here. So I'm going to press Shift D and then X, and then again holding Control, I can just snap it to the central vertex on that pipe and then drag it up on the Y and then press R90. Okay, so looking at it in solid view, I think that represents what's going on in the concept pretty well. Looking back at the concept for the lower pipes then, I'm going to use the same process to set those up, and there are two bends and then two straights and then a T section and then another bend, and then up here there's a T section and the end of that embeds into the cavern wall. So before I start working on the smaller pipes, I want to move this larger one to its own layer for neatness. So I'm going to box select them, and then I'm going to move them to this empty layer, which is layer 4. So I'm going to press M and then just click and place them on layer 4. So now I can press Alt H and bring my smaller pipes back. So the first thing I want to do is get this pipe bend lying flat. So I'm going to select it and then rotate it in the X axis, so R, X and -90. And then I want to duplicate it. I'm going to do that in my top view. And I'm going to go into wireframe and then press Shift D, X, holding Control, and then snap it to the central vertex there. Then I'm going to drag it up on the Y axis with Control, and then I'm going to rotate it -90, so R -90. And you may be wondering why sometimes I'll say the axis and sometimes I don't, and that's because when I'm in a top or a front or a side view, the axis that you can't see, in this case the Z axis, it is kind of taken for granted, and so I can just press R90 rather than RZ90. Anyway, the next thing I want to do is rotate this so that the pipe is pointing down at the ground. So I'm going to rotate this in the Y axis, and I'm going to do RY -90. Okay, the next thing is to snap a straight section to the end of this bend here. So for now I'm going to move my T section out of the way, and I'm going to do this in my front view actually. I'm going to select the pipe and then, as before, hold Control and just snap it to the end there. So now I need another straight, so I'm going to press Shift D and then X and then hold Control and then snap it to the end. And now I need a T section, so I'm going to select my T section and, as before, hold Control and just snap it to the end. Okay, next I need another bend at this end of the pipe. So I'm going to do this in my top view. I'm going to select this bend here and then press, again, Shift D, X, and then hold Control and then snap it to the end of that whole pipe. And now I need to rotate this around, so I'm going to press R180. And I need it to be rotating the other way, so I need to rotate it in the X axis. So I'm going to press RX 180. And I want there to be a straight attached to the end of this so that there's plenty of pipe to embed into the cavern wall. So I'm going to select one of my straights again and then press Shift D, X, hold Control and snap it to the center there. Then I'm going to drag that up on the Y axis and then press R90. Okay, next I need another T section attached to this one. So I'm going to select it. I'm going to do this in my front view. And I want to snap it to the center of this part of the pipe here. So I'm going to duplicate it, then press X, hold Control, and then snap it to there. And then drag it up on the Z axis. And then rotate it 90 degrees, so R90. And I'm going to go into my top view, and I want to rotate this so that this part of the T section is facing in this direction along the Y axis. So I'm going to press R, -90, and I want to attach a straight to the end of this as well. So I'm going to select this one and then duplicate it again, X, and then hold Control, snap it to there, then drag it up on the Y axis. But in this case, because I did that in the top view, this is still down here and I need it to be attached to this part here. So what I can do is just hold Control and click on the Z axis and then snap it to the central vertex there. And then I can go back to my top view and then just press R90 and that will put it in place. So okay, now I've got my lower pipes basically put together, and I'm going to put these on the same layer as the larger pipes. So I'm going to select all of them and then press M, and I'm going to put them on layer 4. So now if I switch to layer 4, I've got all of my pipes, but I need to arrange them so that they're put together properly as in the concept. So I need to put the smaller pipes at the bottom, and then I can group them all together and move them around as a group in relation to the other parts of the scene. So for now I'm just going to eyeball it. I'm going to put it into front view. I've got all of these still selected, so I'm just going to move them down, and I want to move them along so that the vertical section here is roughly in the center of this back part of the larger pipe. So I'm just going to do that in the top view. I'm just going to go into wireframe and move that over and then move it up on the Y, and I think somewhere like that. Okay, so back in solid view, I'm just going to double check the concept. I think that looks pretty close to what's going on in the concept. So now I can group them together. I'm just going to parent all of them to one of the pipe sections so I can move it around easily as a group. And I'm going to select this one, and then I'm going to box select the rest, and the one that I selected first will be the active object. So I'm going to press Ctrl P and then choose object. So now they're all parented to that central pipe there. And if you don't like the relationship lines being visible, they can get a bit messy like this. You can go down here on the properties shelf, and there's a tick box for relationship lines, so you can just switch those off if you like. But I do tend to leave them on just so that I'm very clear that that is part of a parenting group. If I go back to layer 1, I've still got this T section that I made for the larger set of pipes, and I don't need it right now, but I may decide later on that I want to use it somewhere. So I'm going to select that, and for now I'm just going to put it on the 5th layer with the characters, just as a spare. So I'm going to press M and then move that to the 5th layer. Next I want to shift and click on my 2nd and 3rd layers to bring those objects back, and I'm going to select the parent of this pipe group, and I'm going to go into my front view and move them up so that the bend at the bottom of this pipe here is pretty much resting on the ground. And as I mentioned before, I'm just going to eyeball this until I've got the Cavem in place, and I'm going to go into my top view and wireframe, and I want to rotate the pipes around 90 degrees, so R90, and then I'm just going to move them back to around here. I'm just going to check the concept. Yeah, I think that's roughly right. That will do for now, certainly. And so if I go into my ortho view and solid mode, I've now got the main man-made elements in place, and so the next thing to make is the Cavem. To make the Cavem, I'm going to start by placing simple objects to represent these columns. There are 2 in the foreground and 1 in the background. And when I've got the placings of those pretty much right, I can then go ahead and make the rest of the model. So I'm going to shift click on my first layer, which I always regard as my working layer, and then I'm going to create a new cube with Shift A and then Mesh Cube. And going into my front view and wireframe, I want the bottom of the cube to stay where it is, but I'm going to lift the top verts up above the machine to somewhere around here. So in edit mode, I'm going to drop my selection and select those verts with B, and then just move that up to about there. So this is going to represent one of my columns, and in solid view I'm going to go back into object mode. First I'm going to place the column that's at the back here, and it's roughly in between the pipe and the machine there. So I'm going to move that along, and I'm just placing these very roughly. I'm just eyeballing it, and again looking back at the concept, I think the column is slightly behind this pipe here. So I'm going to move that up on the y-axis and place it somewhere like that, maybe a little bit further. Okay, next I'm going to place the one on the right here. So I think it's fairly in line with the one at the back. It's maybe closer to the viewer, so slightly to the left, and it's fairly close to the conveyor belt track there. So I'm going to duplicate this, but in this view I can press Shift Z, which will restrict movement on the Z axis, and I can just move it freely on the X and Y. So I'm going to move it slightly to the left of the line and leave it fairly close to the conveyor belt like that. Okay, now I'm going to look at the one on the left, and this is in line pretty well with the conveyor belt track there, and it looks fairly in line with the one on the right here. So I'm going to duplicate this one again with Shift D and then Shift Z to lock it to the X and the Y axis, and I'm going to move it to somewhere, let's say there. I think that's pretty close. Next I need to make the floor for the Cavem. One of the things I need to pay attention to is the entrances, where the conveyor belt enters and leaves the cave. I've got these kind of tunnels, and when I make my floor, which will be a plane to begin with, I need to extrude some edges out of that plane to represent the beginnings of the floor plan. So this floor plan will include an extrusion on each side for these tunnels. So back in Blender I'm going to go into top view and wireframe, and I'm going to start with a plane. So I'm going to press Shift A, mesh, plane, and I want to scale this up so that it encompasses all of the features I've got so far. So I'm going to scale it up with S and then just type 12. I think that's pretty close. On the right hand side I want the pipes to embed in the cavern wall, so I don't really want this edge here to go any further to the right, and the edge lines up quite well with the conveyor belt end there, and the same on this side. But this edge is a bit too close to this column. I need it to be further down, so I'm going to tab into edit mode and then drop my selection and then just select these verts and move them down. Okay, so next I need to cut some edges into this to create my extrusions for my tunnels. So I'm going to press Ctrl R and then click and then slide that edge so that it's fairly close to the conveyor belt there. Then I'm going to do one on the other side, so Ctrl R and then just move that to around here. So next I'm going to do the ones for the end of the conveyor belt on this side, and so I'm going to do Ctrl R, click and slide it, and then one for the other side. Okay, now I want to Control Tab into edge mode and select this edge and extrude it along the X axis, so E, X, and just move it out to somewhere like that. And then do the same for this edge up here along the Y axis, E, Y, and then just move it up to about there. Okay, next thing I want to do is create some more cuts in the center, and if I do Ctrl R and just place this cut just above the base of the machine, and then do another one vertically, so Ctrl R, click and slide. If I now Control Tab into face mode, and then I can select this face in the center, it means that there's a polygon directly over the machine, and when I turn this into a three-dimensional room, this will make it much easier to shape the ceiling later. Okay, so zooming out, I think I've got the floor plan pretty much in place, and we'll be making lots of changes to this geometry later, so the exact placement of all of these corners and so on, I'm not too worried about right now. These major features are what I was concerned with. So what I want to do next is go into my front view, and then I want to give this some height so that it's about as high as the machine. So I'm going to tab into edit mode again, and then press A twice to make sure everything's selected. And then I'm just going to extrude this up. So I'm going to press E and then just bring that up to about there. So looking at it now in solid mode, I've got this kind of block essentially, and I want to be able to see inside it. So I'm going to press A twice again to drop my selection and then select everything. And I want to press W for the specials menu and then choose flip normals. And at this stage, if you choose flip normals and you can't see through the object, it's worth checking in your properties shelf that backface culling is active. Next I'm going to go into my front view, and I want to cut an edge all the way along the center of this object. So I'm going to press Ctrl R and then click, and then right click to leave that edge in place. So now I've got this edge going all the way around, and the reason I've done that is that I want to shape these cave entrances a bit better. At the moment they're the same height as the cavern, and I want them to be about half the height. So I'm going to Control Tab into vertex mode, and then selecting this vertex, I'm going to press G and then hold Control and then just snap it to this vertex here. And then I'm going to do the same on the opposite side, so G, Control, and then snap it to there. And that's made this kind of ugly twisted face here, but that's okay, I'm going to fix that next. I'm going to go over to the other cave entrance and do the same thing, so G, Control, and then snap, and then same again. And now if I press A to deselect and then A to select everything, I'm going to press Ctrl V for the vertex menu and then choose Remove Doubles. So it will take those vertices at these corners and merge them into one and clean up that geometry for me. Next I want to begin shaping the ceiling of the cavern. It's very blocky at the moment. So I'm going to go into wireframe view and front view, and then I'm going to drop my current selection and then select all of the vertices that make up the top. And the vertices that make up this face that we cut in earlier on in the center, I'm going to hold shift and deselect those. And then I'm going to lower the rest down just a little bit. And there's a row of vertices here and here, so I'm going to deselect those as well. And that will leave the vertices going around the edge of the object. So I can just lower those down a little bit further. And that's giving us the very basic beginnings of our domed ceiling. The next thing I want to do is combine the pillars with the body of the cavern. So I'm going to go into object mode, and then I'm going to shift select the pillars and then the cavern last. And then over here in the tools tab there's an option called join. So if I click that, it will combine them all into one object. So for now I'm going to hide the other objects in the scene with shift H. And if I go into solid view and then edit mode and then drop my current selection, if I hover over one of the pillars and press L to select linked, you can see that this is still a separate element of this new object, and really I want all of the geometry to be continuous and meshed in. And I'm going to do that using a modifier. So if I go into my object mode, come over here to the modifier panel and then choose remesh. The first thing it does is flip the normals the other way, which isn't much use to us right now. So I'm going to look at it in wireframe view while I'm working with the modifier. And the next thing I'm going to do is change my ortho view to perspective view instead. If you look up here where it says ortho, when I press 5 on the keypad, it toggles to perspective view, and that allows me to place the viewport camera inside the object. And one of the things you'll notice is that the pillars are now missing. And that's because if you look over here at the options for the modifier, there's an option here called octree depth, which is kind of a level of resolution that the modifier uses to remake the model with new geometry. And it defaults to 4, and at the moment that's too low to show the pillars as part of our new object. And just to show you what I mean, if I click this down to say 2, it's remaking the object with far fewer polygons, and as a result we're losing a lot of definition, including the pillars. So if I change the octree depth to, let's say 5, and then zoom back inside the object, if I go into my solid view, even though these normals are flipped, you can see I now have my columns back in place. Okay, the next thing, if you look at the roof of the cavern now, and I'm going to go into wireframe, there's some difficult looking geometry here. There's some overlapping polygons and things like this, and I just want to neaten that up and also give the cave a bit more of a rounded appearance. And so I'm going to change the mode for the modifier from sharp to smooth, and that will round off all the corners and make the geometry that makes up the ceiling of the cavern a bit more even. So now that I've got that in place, I'm going to freeze the modifier by clicking the apply button, and then I can go into edit mode again and then press A to select everything, and then bring up the specials menu with W and then flip normals. So now if I look at it in object mode, you can see I've got the interior of the cave and all of the columns are in place and attached.
Hi, AD Burrows here, just wrapping it up. Many thanks to Martin for taking us through this chapter. Next time we'll be taking a look at sculpting a lot more detail into the cave, so see you then.